March 31st, 2025, was a day that many American political observers would later look back on with curiosity. The White House had been transformed into an unlikely backdrop for an event that seemed almost too surreal to believe. Kid Rock, the ever-controversial country rock star, had invited a select few guests to a private dinner at the White House, and among the invited were two prominent figures who would send shockwaves across the media: comedian Bill Maher and UFC President Dana White. Kid Rock, known for his unapologetic support of President Donald Trump, had long been a fixture in Trump's circle. The invitation to Maher, a staunch liberal who had often been vocal in his criticism of Trump, left many wondering what would unfold when the two high-profile figures met under such unusual circumstances. The dinner was scheduled to be a casual, private gathering, far removed from the usual political banter or media frenzy. But its significance would come to the forefront once the evening's events began to unfold. Bill Maher, the host of the popular HBO talk show Real Time with Bill Maher, had made his disdain for Trump no secret. His late-night monologues frequently skewered the president, highlighting his policies, his character, and his controversial stances. But Maher, like many in the world of comedy and television, was not someone easily swayed by partisan lines. He could be critical, but he was also pragmatic when it came to understanding the nature of politics and the complexities that came with being in power. This made his attendance at the dinner all the more intriguing. Kid Rock, who had spent years publicly aligning himself with Trump's political agenda, had managed to orchestrate an event that blended politics, entertainment, and the unpredictable nature of American culture. As the night began, Maher, Dana White, and the other guests made their way to the White House, not knowing that this dinner would mark a turning point in the public narrative surrounding Trump's presidency. Maher had been initially skeptical about the event. He had long prided himself on his ability to stand firm in his beliefs, especially when it came to critiquing Trump. But as he entered the White House, he couldn't help but feel a sense of history in the making. Dana White, a longtime friend of Trump, greeted Maher with a handshake and a friendly smile. White was one of the few people who had managed to navigate the world of mixed martial arts and politics with relative ease, and he was no stranger to media scrutiny. The atmosphere was surprisingly laid back. There was no heavy political rhetoric, no pointed arguments, just casual conversation and laughter. As the dinner proceeded, Maher found himself in a group of people who were surprisingly down to earth. Kid Rock, wearing his signature cowboy hat and casual attire, was making small talk with Trump's staff. Dana White was discussing UFC developments with some of the president's advisors. And Trump himself, although present and smiling, was not at the center of attention. Instead, the night was more about the guests, their interactions, and the unspoken tension that hovered in the air. Bill Maher could feel the weight of the moment. Here he was, sitting at the White House, sharing a meal with some of the most influential people in American politics and entertainment. And despite his public animosity toward Trump, there was something undeniable about the surrealism of the situation. As Maher looked around the room, he couldn't help but feel a shift in his perception. This dinner was not just a social event, it was a moment of political theater, and the stage had been set. But little did Maher know, his time at the dinner would leave a lasting impression on his views of Trump and his presidency. As the evening continued, Maher would be forced to reconcile the man he had so often mocked with the one sitting across from him. The dinner was about to take an unexpected turn. As the evening progressed, the private dinner at the White House took on an unexpected, more intimate vibe. There were no cameras, no crew lurking around, just a small group of influential people gathered to enjoy the evening. Bill Maher, despite his initial reluctance, began to observe the interactions around him, his mind working furiously as he tried to make sense of the strange and unexpected dynamics unfolding in front of him. Seated next to Dana White, Maher found himself in the middle of a conversation that was far from the combative political debates he was used to. White, as usual, was full of energy and stories, shifting between talking about the latest developments in the UFC and giving Maher an inside look at what it was like to be so closely associated with Trump. White spoke with a sense of respect for the president that Maher couldn't quite fathom at first. There was no cynicism, no mockery, just a genuine admiration for Trump's ability to navigate the complex world of politics and business. You know, White said, leaning in slightly, Trump's a real deal maker. He gets things done, and he knows how to make people believe in what he's selling. Maher, who had spent years poking fun at Trump's business practices and larger-than-life persona, found himself momentarily speechless. He had always viewed Trump through the lens of his public persona. Brash, bombastic, and at times reckless. But hearing White speak so reverently about the man was jarring. Could it be possible that there was more to Trump than Maher had allowed himself to see? Across the table, Kid Rock and Trump were engaged in a conversation that oscillated between lighthearted banter and more serious political discourse. The president was smiling and laughing, as if the weight of the office had momentarily lifted from his shoulders. He was telling a story about a recent political win, one that had garnered him praise from unexpected quarters, but there was no arrogance in his tone. Instead, he seemed more like a man reflecting on a job well done. Maher couldn't help but feel an odd sense of admiration for Trump in that moment. The man was a paradox. Brash yet charming, divisive yet capable of connecting with people on a personal level. As the conversation shifted, Maher found himself drawn into it. Trump had noticed him sitting quietly and, with his characteristic confidence, leaned over. "Bill, I've watched your show. You've got guts, man," Trump said, his voice carrying that unmistakable drawl. "You say whatever's on your mind, and that's something I respect. You and I don't always agree, but you've got a certain honesty about you." For a moment, Maher was taken aback. This wasn't the combative president he was used to seeing on the news, constantly firing back at critics. This was a more subdued version of Trump, one that was engaging directly with him almost like an equal. Maher felt his skepticism start to chip away, even if just a little. He was accustomed to seeing Trump through the lens of media soundbites and political discourse, but here he was, sitting across from him in the White House, breaking bread, having a conversation without the usual barriers of partisanship or rhetoric. "Thanks," Maher replied, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of curiosity. "I don't think I've ever heard you give someone a compliment like that." Trump chuckled. "Well, maybe I'm not as bad as the media makes me out to be, huh?" He winked, and Maher could see the familiar glint in his eyes, a mixture of self-awareness and playfulness that was often overshadowed by the president's more aggressive public persona. The conversation turned to politics, as it inevitably would in a room like this, but it was different from what Maher had expected. Trump wasn't lobbing insults at his opponents or touting his own achievements. Instead, he spoke with a sense of pragmatism, as though he was a man who understood the weight of the decisions he had made and was now reflecting on them with a rare honesty. Dana White, who had been listening quietly, added his own perspective. "Trump's not always what people think he is. He gets a lot of hate, but he knows how to play the game and get things done. I respect that." Maher leaned back in his chair, processing the words. He had spent so much time focusing on Trump's more controversial moments that it had been easy to overlook the complexity of his character. Sure, the president was far from perfect, but in this intimate setting, Maher began to see a side of Trump that had been buried beneath the media circus. As the evening wore on, the conversations began to shift toward lighter topics. Kid Rock regaled the group with stories from his music career, Dana White cracked jokes about the absurdities of the UFC world, and Trump, for all his bravado, was surprisingly self-deprecating at times. In the background, servers discreetly refilled glasses and brought out the next course, but the atmosphere remained relaxed, almost familial. It was at this moment that Maher realized how much he had underestimated the situation. What he had initially thought would be a polarizing, tense evening was turning out to be far more nuanced. The president was no longer just the subject of his late-night monologues. He was a person, sitting across from him, engaging in an honest conversation. The dinner wasn't changing Maher's stance on Trump's policies or leadership, but it was forcing him to confront the man behind the headlines. And that, Maher realized, was an experience few people ever got to have. As dessert was served, the conversation seemed to slow, and the once lively banter among the guests quieted down. The rich aroma of coffee and chocolate cake filled the room, and Maher found himself pondering the events of the evening. It wasn't just the food or the surreal setting that was on his mind. It was the strange, almost surreal shift in his perception of Donald Trump. The man he had spent years mocking, the man whose every move had been dissected in ways that felt almost pathological, was sitting in front of him, entirely different from the bombastic caricature he had crafted in his mind. "Bill, I've got to say, you've been doing your thing for a long time," Trump said, his tone still warm, but with a hint of genuine admiration. "You don't shy away from calling things as you see them. That's rare these days." Maher shifted in his seat, slightly uncomfortable but also intrigued. "You really think so?" he replied, not knowing exactly how to respond. "I've never been afraid to go after the people in power, whether it's you or anyone else. But I guess we don't hear that much about the people who get called out, do we?" Trump gave him a knowing look, almost as though he'd been waiting for this moment. "It's easy to be loud when you're on top, Bill, but it's harder to take the heat and keep going. That's something I respect. You're tough. You don't let the noise get to you." The praise wasn't what Maher had expected. For a man who had been at the center of a whirlwind of controversy for years, Trump had a remarkable way of delivering compliments. It was more than just flattery. It was a recognition of Maher's resilience, a characteristic that Trump himself had cultivated over the years in the face of public scrutiny. And perhaps Maher realized it was this very trait that had drawn him to Trump in the first place, though he had never admitted it until now. All right, Maher said, trying to downplay the moment with a wry smile. "I'll take the compliment, but I don't think I'm ever going to be as tough as you, Mr. President." Trump grinned. "You might surprise yourself." The conversation lingered on for a while, with Maher now engaging in a more thoughtful dialogue about the state of the country, the media, and the complexities of leadership. What struck him most was that Trump wasn't dismissing Maher's criticisms. Instead, he seemed to understand them, acknowledging the points where the comedian's jabs were valid, even if they didn't fit the narrative that most people expected from him. For someone like Maher, who had spent years in front of an audience, taking shots at everyone from politicians to celebrities, it was rare to find himself in a situation where the target of his criticism actually listened, without the usual defensive posturing. In many ways, it felt like a conversation between two veterans of their respective fields, each with their own battles to fight, yet somehow able to find common ground in the strangest of places. The night continued, and the laughter started to return. But there was an underlying tension that hadn't quite dissipated. The weight of the evening's conversations hung in the air. Kid Rock had taken a break from the spotlight to engage in one of his well-known rants about the state of the music industry. But Trump, Dana White, and Maher seemed to be in a bubble of their own. And as the night drew to a close, Maher felt the shift in his mindset. He wasn't just talking to a politician anymore. He was talking to a person who, despite everything, had the power to shape history. "Bill," Trump began again as the evening wound down, "I know you've got your show tomorrow, and I don't want to keep you too late. But let me just say this, you've got a tough job. The media's a tricky beast, and I get that. But sometimes, it's easy to forget how hard it is to be in the trenches. You've been in the game a long time. I respect that." There it was again, another layer of respect, an unspoken acknowledgement that Maher was, in his own way, playing the same game as Trump. They were both people who had built careers on challenging the status quo, albeit in very different ways. But somehow, in this strange setting, the lines between the two had blurred, and for a brief moment, it felt like they were on the same side of the political spectrum, facing the same adversities. "Thanks," Maher said, his voice softer now. "That means more than you probably realize." The night ended with a cordial handshake, and as Maher made his way to the door, he found himself reflecting on the evening's events. What had started as an unlikely gathering had turned into a moment of profound introspection. The dinner with Kid Rock, Dana White, and Trump had given Maher a new perspective, not only on Trump but on the broader landscape of American politics. The divisions between people, the mockery and the praise, it was all part of the larger narrative, and Maher realized that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to engage with these differences without completely abandoning one's principles. The following days after the private dinner at the White House were filled with intense speculation and intrigue. Bill Maher, a master of stirring controversy, had just attended an event that seemed to defy the usual expectations of American politics. A late-night comedian, known for his sharp critiques of Trump, had sat down for an intimate dinner organized by none other than Kid Rock, a staunch Trump supporter. The dinner was more than just a gathering of celebrities. It had become the talk of the nation as soon as Maher returned to his studio. He knew that the conversation about his evening at the White House would be unavoidable. Real Time with Bill Maher was already preparing for its next episode, but Maher knew that he would need to address the elephant in the room: the dinner with Trump. What followed was one of the most anticipated episodes of his career. As the lights dimmed and the cameras rolled, Maher walked onto the stage with his usual swagger. The audience greeted him with their trademark applause, but Maher could tell that they were waiting for him to speak on the dinner. He could feel the tension as he took his seat behind the desk, looking out into the crowd. All right, Maher began, a half-smile on his face. So, I know you're all dying to hear about my dinner with the president. Yes, it happened. Yes, it was at the White House. And yes, Kid Rock was there, wearing his cowboy hat like he's about to ride a bull at a country fair. The crowd laughed, but Maher could sense the anticipation building. He paused for effect, letting the humor settle before addressing the matter at hand. But let's get serious for a second. I'm sure you're all wondering what it was like to sit down with the man who's been the target of every political joke I've made for the last 4 years. What's it like to share a meal with a guy who's been the subject of late-night comedy specials and media scrutiny? Well, let me tell you this. It was strange. He leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning the audience, letting them hang on every word. Because, here's the thing. I didn't walk into that dinner expecting to change my mind about Donald Trump. I didn't expect him to suddenly win me over with his charm. But you know what? There was something different about him in that setting. He wasn't the brash, bombastic figure we see on Twitter every day. He was just a guy sitting down for a meal, engaging in a conversation with people who didn't always agree with him. And let me tell you, that's something we rarely see. The audience was quiet now, paying attention as Maher continued. I've spent years criticizing him. I've joked about his hair, his policies, his whole thing. But that night, I saw a side of him I wasn't expecting. Was it a side I agreed with? No. Was it a side I respected? Maybe. He's a guy who's been through a lot, who's taken a lot of heat, and he can still sit there and talk about it without flipping a table or launching a Twitter attack. And in a weird way, that's kind of impressive. The response was mixed. Some viewers applauded the honesty, while others questioned the sincerity of Maher's newfound respect for Trump. The media immediately began buzzing with speculation about Maher's stance. Was he softening? Was this a political pivot? Was he just trying to drum up ratings? On social media, the reactions were just as polarized. Bill Maher is a sellout, some users wrote, accusing him of going soft on Trump for the sake of a good story. Others praised Maher for his willingness to engage with the president on a personal level, even if they didn't agree politically. The media frenzy didn't let up. News outlets picked up the story, spinning it in every direction imaginable. Bill Maher praises Trump in shocking twist, one headline blared. Comedian breaks silence on dinner with Kid Rock and Trump. Read another. The implications were vast. After all, Maher was a prominent liberal voice, and his words carried weight. The dinner had sparked a conversation about political polarization, the possibility of bridging divides, and the challenges of engaging with individuals who hold opposing views. But perhaps the most significant ripple came from Trump's own supporters, who seized upon Maher's comments as a victory. For them, Maher's acknowledgement of Trump's humanity was a rare moment of validation. They were quick to point to Maher's admission that Trump had impressed him as evidence that the president wasn't the villain the media made him out to be. Kid Rock, ever the provocateur, took to Twitter to celebrate the dinner. Bill Maher finally gets it. You can't judge a book by its cover. Great dinner with @Real Donald Trump. We need more of this in America. But not everyone was convinced. Critics on the left viewed Maher's praise as a betrayal. He's selling out. This is what happens when you get too close to power, they argued. They accused him of losing touch with his progressive roots and allowing himself to be swayed by the president's charm. The liberal echo chamber was quick to criticize Maher for giving Trump any form of validation. Maher, ever the skeptic, wasn't surprised by the backlash. He knew that taking a nuanced stance would inevitably alienate some of his audience. But the fact remained that he had experienced something rare, a personal connection with the president, outside of the vitriol of politics. And whether people liked it or not, that was part of the story he felt compelled to tell. The next day, Maher addressed the media firestorm. On Real Time, he didn't back down from his comments. Instead, he doubled down, clarifying that while he still disagreed with Trump on many fronts, he appreciated the president's resilience and his ability to engage with those who opposed him. It was a message that resonated with many viewers who had grown tired of the constant fighting and division in American politics. "I still think Trump's policies are misguided," Maher said on air. "But I also think that if we only focus on the sound bites and never have a real conversation, we'll never get anywhere." That night was an opportunity to talk to the man as a person, not as a punchline. And for me, that was valuable. In the days and weeks that followed, the dinner hosted by Kid Rock at the White House became more than just a brief headline. It continued to dominate conversations across the media landscape, and its effects began to ripple through American society in unexpected ways. The dinner had become a symbol, not just of an unlikely gathering between a late-night comedian, a controversial president, and their circle of associates, but of a broader conversation about political civility, dialogue, and the power of human connection in a deeply divided nation. For Bill Maher, the fallout was complex. He was bombarded with questions in interviews and on social media. People wanted answers. They wanted to know if he had changed his views on Trump, if he was now more sympathetic toward the president's policies, or if this was all just a publicity stunt. But Maher remained steadfast in his commitment to the truth as he saw it. "I didn't change my political views after that dinner," Maher reiterated on air during a follow-up episode of Real Time. "I still think Trump is a divisive force. I still think his policies are often reckless. But that's not the same thing as saying he's a cartoon villain. The guy has some redeeming qualities. Whether you like it or not, that's a fact." This was perhaps the most critical takeaway from the entire experience. The notion that people, even those with whom you vehemently disagree, are more complicated than the one-dimensional personas we often create for them. For Maher, this had been an uncomfortable but necessary lesson in empathy, something that was desperately lacking in today's polarized political climate. The dinner itself, initially seen as a bizarre and inconsequential event, turned into a flashpoint for a national conversation about how Americans can and should engage with one another in a time of deep division. It raised the question of whether it's possible to disagree on fundamental issues, even vehemently, and still find ways to connect as human beings. Across the political spectrum, some began to adopt Maher's approach, recognizing that finding common ground was essential to moving forward. In communities across the country, people from opposite ends of the political spectrum began to engage in more honest and respectful dialogues, inspired by the notion that it's possible to disagree while still respecting the humanity of others. On the right, many of Trump's supporters felt vindicated by Maher's comments. The media backlash from liberals only strengthened their belief that Maher, despite his comedic and political critiques, was finally acknowledging what they had long argued: that Trump wasn't just an entertainer or a tyrant, but a figure who had made real accomplishments during his time in office. Some even went so far as to say that Maher's words marked the beginning of a shift in liberal attitudes toward the president. For Maher, this shift in perception wasn't about endorsing Trump's presidency. Instead, it was about creating space for a broader conversation that didn't revolve around the polarizing extremes that had come to define American politics. "It's not about agreeing with Trump," he told one interviewer. "It's about understanding that we can't just vilify people we disagree with. There's a humanity in every person, and that humanity deserves respect, even if we think their ideas are wrong." This message found an unexpected ally in none other than Kid Rock himself, who took to social media to share his thoughts on the dinner and the subsequent reactions. "Glad Bill Maher came to the White House and saw the real Trump. No fakeness, just real talk. We need more of this kind of openness, folks. We need to stop acting like the other side is evil just because they don't think like us." Kid Rock's words resonated with his followers, who were largely conservative, and he praised Maher for his willingness to approach the dinner with an open mind. That's what America needs: more conversation and less shouting. Trump's done a lot for this country, and Bill's respect for that is something we should all appreciate. For Trump, the dinner and its aftermath were less about political capital and more about consolidating his base. His supporters were quick to take Maher's words as proof that Trump was a more complicated figure than the media made him out to be. But the president remained steadfast in his own brand of political combativeness, dismissing those who criticized him while touting his supposed achievements. Yet, even as Trump played the game of politics with his usual flair, Maher's words had begun to resonate with a new segment of the population, those tired of the endless cycles of partisanship. Many who had been on the fence, unsure whether there was any way to break free from the constant culture wars, found themselves questioning the validity of their own assumptions. For Maher, the impact of the dinner was more subtle but profound. It didn't change his career, but it certainly changed how he viewed the world. By allowing himself to step outside his usual political bubble, he had gained a deeper understanding of the American political landscape. And while he would continue to challenge Trump's policies and the direction of the country, he also recognized that change, if it was to happen, would require something more than just mocking or dismissing those with opposing views. The aftermath of the dinner, for all its public spectacle and media frenzy, had an unexpected effect. It sparked a dialogue that transcended the partisan divide. And while the country remained deeply divided, Maher and many others began to realize that dialogue itself, honest, open, and even uncomfortable at times, was the only way forward as the weeks passed. The furor surrounding the dinner began to die down, but the lessons learned from that evening continued to echo throughout the political and cultural landscape. In a deeply fractured America, moments like these were rare, and while they didn't offer any easy answers or solutions, they provided a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even the most unlikely of connections could lead to meaningful change. With that, the story of Bill Maher's unexpected praise for Trump after attending the private dinner organized by Kid Rock had come full circle. It wasn't just a dinner. It was a reflection of the deep divisions and possible paths forward for a nation desperate to find common ground. The dinner, though short-lived, had sparked a conversation that would likely shape the way people thought about politics and the possibilities of bridging even the most entrenched divides in American society.